So, hello everybody. Unfortunately, I have to re-record this because during the actual session at this stage, we came up across a group of individuals who had the collective IQ of around 7, and they kept on interrupting the session, screaming random stuff, asking if Hitler was responsible for killing Kennedy, and taking their microphone and being like, so yeah. Anyway, thanks to them, I have to re-record this now. So, where did Hitler come from? So, who was Hitler, really? So, Hitler was the son of an Austrian official in the Austrian bureaucracy. As you can clearly see from his painting in the middle of the screen, he was clearly not qualified to become an artist, because this is a horrible painting, very ugly, very bad. But he was a long-time nationalist, and when World War I broke out, he decided to fight for Germany. But he only managed to do so because of a series of bureaucratic mistakes. First of all, he appealed to the King of Bavaria to allow him to fight in the Bavarian army. And this was because Bavaria, which was basically operating with relatively high autonomy within the German Empire, had its own army, which was somewhat integrated into the German army, but was nevertheless separate. And the King of Bavaria had the authority to allow foreigners to join up, and Hitler applied for that. However, on principle, the King of Bavaria never allowed this, and Hitler should have been deported. But due to a bureaucratic mistake, his application was actually accepted, and then another bureaucratic mistake was made, which listed him as a member of the regular German army and not the Bavarian army. Now, we have to remember, though, that Hitler was actually a genuine war hero. He wasn't just somebody who was sitting around in the back of the front doing nothing, well behind the front, as some propaganda might want you to believe. He was a genuine hero. And he was even considered for an officer's promotion at one point, and he earned, I believe, the 2nd level of the Iron Cross for his bravery. Because after a short run in the infantry, Hitler basically spent most of the war as a messenger, as a runner. He would run across the open terrain between the trenches, or between the front line and the rear, under enemy fire often, and artillery fire, but still running. And he was very well respected by his colleagues. He was wounded, but basically left the hospital as soon as he could and decided to go back to the front lines. And he was always well known for his general interest in the larger scheme of the war. He wasn't just interested in what he could see out of his trench, he wanted to know the whole big picture. And as soon as Hitler returns to Germany, he very quickly goes into politics. And he joins the NSDAP, at this point a very small radical party, the National Socialist Workers' Party. And he leads this party, soon basically becoming its primary figure, and in 1923 attempts to carry out a coup known as the Munich Beer Hall Putsch. However, this fails miserably, and he ends up in prison. But for this horrible crime of trying to overthrow the government and starting an armed insurrection, Hitler isn't sentenced to 50 years or death. He's only sentenced to around a year. And this was because the judges were very sympathetic. In the courtroom, he stood up and he talked about how everything he did was out of a love for Germany. And we need to consider that the judges who were judging him, they used to be officials for Imperial Germany. They grew up in Imperial Germany, and they believed in the values of the old Imperial Germany, not of this new Weimar Republic. They were anti-democratic elites, you could say. And being sympathetic, they only gave him basically the minimum that they had to. And whilst being in prison, Hitler retaught some stuff. First of all, he wrote Mein Kampf, which, I'll be honest, is not a great book. It's not particularly insightful, it's more like a bunch of random rambling. And he also rethought the strategy, because Hitler decided that, okay, I guess that trying to overthrow the government not gonna work. Instead, maybe I should indeed try to win the elections. And that is the NSDAP's strategy going forward. After leaving prison, he dumped Ludendorff. Ludendorff was one of the two top German generals by the end of World War I, alongside Hindenburg, who would go on to become the president of the Weimar Republic. Ludendorff was more radical, we could say, but basically removing Ludendorff from the party, separating himself from Ludendorff, he goes on based on his own momentum. And he eventually rises to chancellor, although we won't go into too much detail, because once again, this is a foreign policy focused presentation. So, why was it possible for Hitler to take over for the Weimar democracy? First of all, we had the fallout of the Versailles Treaty. So while the Germans, were initially actually quite enthusiastic about the prospect of democracy, when the terms of the treaty came back, attitudes changed. First of all, it was seen as a diktat, that it was imposed on them against their will, because they accepted the armistice, having heard the 14 points, the concepts of self-determination, of peace without victors. But now they're being forced to take responsibility for the war and pay reparations. And what's even more shocking for them is that the principle of self-determination is being violated to take away German territory, as in the case of Danzig, for example. And even more so, we also have the issue that the eastern border is completely changed up, despite the fact that many Germans assumed that the treaty would only be binding for the West, because it was signed in the West, with the West, while the war in the East had already been won. And then we also have the stab in the back myth. So this myth that the German army was not actually defeated, that some sort of, fifth column in Germany led to the outcome of the war. Perhaps it was the Jews, perhaps it was the communists, different interpretations. And this stab in the back myth will contribute to the growing rise of anti-Semitism in Germany. But anyway, from the outset, the Versailles Treaty is already undermining Weimar democracy and causing the public to have a negative view of top democratic officials, because after all, it was they who signed this unacceptable, impalatable treaty. Then we have the case of anti-democratic elites. Weimar Republic was always undermined by people like those judges we talked about in the case of Hitler and his trial. But this also extended to teachers, to just regular bureaucrats, to the military, to the rich and the aristocracy. All of these people were not Democrats, they were conservatives, believers in the old German Empire, and they would impress their beliefs and help undermine democracy. For example, the teachers teaching the youth, imprinting their values on the youth. Or in the case of the judges, as we saw, imposing very harsh penalties on communist subverters, but not so much on right-wing ones. And then we also have this problem with the increasing power of the executive branch. The Weimar's parliament, the Reichstag, has a significant issue. After the Great Depression, it's very polarized. As a matter of fact, throughout the late 1920s, it's already becoming more and more polarized, with more Germans voting for more radical options, choosing, for example, the Nazis or the communists rather than more middle ground factions like the SPD socialists. And, it becomes rather ineffective. And in this vacuum, the president takes the reign by increasingly governing through executive orders. And unlike this Reichstag, which keeps on shifting and isn't really achieving anything, the president has high legitimacy. He's been selected by all the people in one vote for a long period of 7 years, and moreover, in the last years of the Weimar Republic, this is the war hero Hindenburg. And then there's also issues in the Constitution like Article 48, which allows the president to use emergency powers for pretty much anything. Next, we have the issue of the radicalization of politics. As we said, the politics are becoming much more radical, but they're also becoming much more violent. We have all these coups and uprisings and putches, but a lot of parties start to develop armed wings. So armed communists, and then of course the NSDAP, the Nazis, have their brown shirts, but other parties had armed wings too. And then we also have the issue of the Red Scare, the sphere of communism. Because while the communists in Germany never really managed to gain a lot of public support or have major achievements, they managed to make a lot of noise with their loud declarations of revolution and their attempted takeovers, as was the case for the Spartacist Uprising in 1919, which at the very outset of the Weimar Republic's birth already made people scared about communism as a factor. But I'd like to once again highlight that we also had uprisings on the other side, like for example, of course, the Beer Hall Putsch, but also the Cap Putsch in 1920, when the army basically marches on Berlin under the command of a conservative general, and he would have been able to take over the government if not for the fact that the bureaucrats in Berlin went on strike and refused to cooperate, which basically meant that nothing could be done by the army. And then just two other key dates. In 1929, that's when the Great Depression hits. In 1933 is when Hitler takes power. Now, just a small note on terminology. The IB likes to use the term putsch to refer to right-wing attempted coups, while using different words, like for example uprisings or revolts or coups, when talking specifically about left-wing groups. So, moving on to Hitler and his foreign policy. So, in 1933, pretty much as soon as he gains power, Hitler decides to leave the League of Nations. In 1934, he makes his first attempt to reunite with Austria, carry out a coup, but this doesn't go very far, and the Italians mobilize troops on the border with Austria, which helps dissuade Hitler. In 1936, that's when the Olympics happen, big publicity stunt for the Nazis, and in 1936, Hitler remilitarizes Rhineland. 1936 through 38-39, we have the Spanish Civil War, where Germany intervenes, sending armed forces, tanks, and air support, notably the Condor Legion, to help the nationalists. And in 1938, we actually finally have Anschluss succeed. Austria is subsumed into Germany, it's annexed. In 1938, Germany gets its Sudetenland away from Czechoslovakia. And a small note on Czechoslovakia right here, because unlike unlike most of the new states which came about after the Versailles treaties, Czechoslovakia was not really governed with self-determination as the basis, because its population of 15 million was 6 million Czech, 4 million Slovak, then 3 million German, mostly living in the Sudetenland, 1.5 million Polish, and then the rest was other random people, largely Ukrainians or Russians, other types of Slavs. So, there wasn't any majority in the country. Even if the Czechs were the largest group, they accounted for only like 2/5 of the country's total population. But even so, it was actually the most successful country because it managed to maintain its democracy, and it also was very economically successful compared to a lot of these other new states. But up to this point, we have to remember that Hitler is actually working with the principle of self-determination in mind, laid out by the League of Nations and Wilson. It's 14 points, well, initially, and then taken up by the League as a core tenet, because he's bringing in the Germans from Austria, he's bringing in the Germans from the Rhineland. So technically there should be no issue if we consider the world from that moral perspective of this moral world order, the League system. But in 1939 this changes because he gets the rest of Czechoslovakia, and now he has basically forced Czechs under his control, despite them not being the major group that Germany was for, and them not being big fans of being subsumed into Germany. And then, after that, we're going to have the Ribbentrop-Molotov Pact in 1939, and then the invasion of Poland goes through on September 1st, 1939, beginning World War II in Europe. Now, what were Hitler's aims of all of this? So first of all, he wanted to bring all the German people under one state, and you can see this happening, but of course, besides what he managed to achieve before World War II, there were other minorities, like for an example, in Poland that he wanted to include. Then we have the case of Lebensraum. Hitler believes that living space is needed for the Germans and the Aryans, and he sees that as the territory which is currently occupied by Slavs. But Slavs for Hitler are subhumans who deserve to only be slaves for the Aryans at best, but we'll get back to that in a second. Then of course he wants to revise the Versailles Treaty and make Germany great again. And then we also have this belief in cooperating with those who are worthy. So obviously the Germans are the master race, but Aryans are also believed to be the people who are in the Nordic countries and in Britain. The French, they're still pretty up there, but not as pure as the Brits and the Scandinavians. The South Europeans are considered as inferior, but not super inferior. Although the exception is made of Italy because, despite having fallout initially, Hitler eventually becomes a good friend and ally of Mussolini, with both leaders admiring each other. So of course, when Hitler's views changed, then the whole Nazi theory of race also changed. And the Slavs were considered to be inferior, and so were some other groups, like obviously Jews and the Roma people, etc. It is actually interesting because the Poles, who are Slavs, have had a higher percentage of people who had blue eyes or blue hair than the Germans. So the Polish and the Polish Slavs were actually more Aryan than the Germans, you could say, which is quite ironic and amusing, as that's what Hitler marked as signs of being Aryan. But anyway, why the Japanese, for example? Why were the Japanese worthy? Well, basically Hitler decided that the Japanese were the master race of the Asian peoples. So they were basically declared to be honorary Aryans. Now, what were Adolf Hitler's methods? Why was he able to be so successful? First of all, he was really skilled at being able to being pragmatic and appearing to be reasonable. For example, he was cautious. When German troops marched into the Rhineland, they had orders to withdraw if the French were to make a move. So Hitler wasn't, risking everything. This isn't the Hitler of 1945 who's riddled by Parkinson's disease and completely disillusioned. This is a sharp mind, a man who knows what he's doing. Then Hitler he also was very good at presenting himself as a reasonable man in front of diplomats and foreign publics, like for example Neville Chamberlain. Then of course we had the issue of bilateral diplomacy. Hitler was good at going around the international system and just making deals with individual countries. And then there was also the willingness to use force. Hitler was ready to use the armed forces when necessary. So, and Hitler also benefited, besides the fact that he was initially following this principle of self-determination, which the British found acceptable, because recall that the British public believed that the Versailles Treaty was unfair on Germany, and what Hitler was doing seemingly was only revising it to be fair. And it wasn't until he annexed the rest of Czechoslovakia that he violated this holy principle, and everybody realized what was going on, and Neville Chamberlain's government, which was selected by these people who are following this moral-based world order and believing in it, lost its popularity among the people, and so did its policies. Now, Adolf also benefited from the fact that there was a lot of focus on other countries doing some stuff at the same time that he was doing his stuff, which was taking over global attention. The Japanese invaded China in 1937. That's a big deal. Then, of course, we had Mussolini and the crisis in Abyssinia. And then we had the Soviets and their involvement in the Spanish Civil War. And of course, the Spanish Civil War, that itself was a big deal. It was taking attention away from Hitler's expansionism. And then we must also consider the Anglo-French Divide. So the French wanted to do something about Hitler, but after their bad experience of being shunned by the rest of the world for being militarists and having a weakened position, they didn't really want to do anything without British approval. And as we noted, the British were basically largely okay with Hitler expanding into territory which was actually occupied by Germanic peoples up until he went against that principle with Czechoslovakia. So yeah, there was support. The British were trying to appease Hitler, and they weren't willing to give the French the go-ahead for there to be a united front against Hitler. Yes, so that's Hitler and his foreign policy.